The town of Granger's Bluff had seen plenty of humiliations in its time. Men dragged through mud over gambling debts, women shamed at church doors for sins real and imagined, but nothing compared to what happened the afternoon the stagecoach rolled in carrying Evelyn Hartwell. Gerald Winthrop saw her first. He was standing outside the mercantile with three other men when the coach door opened, and the moment Evelyn stepped down, dusty travel coat, worn boots, no luggage beyond a single battered trunk, he started laughing. Not a quiet laugh, a full, open-mouthed laugh that turned heads across the street. "That's her?" he called out, loud enough that people 2 storefronts away could hear. "That's the woman Colton Voss is taking as a wife? Lord Almighty, he must be more desperate than I thought." The laughter spread. A woman near the dry goods store covered her mouth. A man leaning against a post shook his head. Evelyn stood on the wooden sidewalk with her trunk at her feet, and she looked at Gerald Winthrop for a long moment, not flinching, not crying, just looking at him the way a person looks at a problem they've seen before and already know how to outlast. She picked up the handle of her trunk and started walking. If you've ever felt like the world made up its mind about you before you opened your mouth, if you've ever walked into a room and felt every eye telling you that you don't belong, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments right now so I can see how far this story has traveled. Because what happens next in Granger's Bluff is something none of those laughing men would ever forget. The stagecoach road into Granger's Bluff was exactly 9 miles of hard-packed dirt that turned to mud every spring and froze solid every November. Evelyn Hartwell had spent the last 4 days on that coach, or variations of it, 3 different lines across 2 states, and she had not slept more than a few broken hours total. Her back ached from the bench. Her mouth tasted like trail dust. The woman who had shared the last leg of the journey with her, a younger woman traveling to meet a sister, had spent most of the ride stealing glances at Evelyn and then looking away when Evelyn noticed. People thought she couldn't see it. She always could. She was 41 years old. That was the first thing anyone noticed about her, before the worn coat, before the single trunk, before the absence of anything that looked like wealth or refinement. 41 was not old by any honest measure, but it was old for a bride in Montana Territory in 1883, and Evelyn understood that as clearly as she understood anything. She had been married before. Her husband, Thomas Hartwell, had died 3 winters ago. Not dramatically, not with any particular story attached to it. He had caught a fever in December and was gone by January, leaving behind 40 acres of struggling land, 2 dead seasons of crops, and debts that Evelyn spent the following 2 years paying off $1 at a time. She had sold the land 6 months ago, sold it for less than it was worth because she needed the money and the buyer knew it. And then she had answered an advertisement placed by a lawyer representing a Montana cattleman named Colton Voss, who required a practical wife capable of managing a large household and withstanding the demands of frontier life. The advertisement had not said anything about love. Evelyn had appreciated that. What the advertisement had also not said, what the lawyer's careful letters had omitted entirely, was that Colton Voss was one of the wealthiest men in 3 counties, that his ranch covered land most small farmers would never see in a lifetime, and that the people of Granger's Bluff had apparently been expecting someone considerably different. Gerald Winthrop's laughter was still audible behind her as she walked. She did not turn around. The lawyer's office was on the main street, between the bank and a feed store. A man named Aldous Pratt had handled the arrangement. Evelyn had exchanged 6 letters with him over 4 months, careful letters full of practical information about her farming experience, her capacity for hard work, her understanding of livestock management. She had not lied in any of those letters. She had also not volunteered that her dress was 3 years old or that her boots had been resoled twice. Pratt was standing in his doorway when she arrived, and she could see immediately from the way his expression settled, a careful flattening, a professional management of surprise, that he had also been expecting something other than what she was. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "you made good time." "The roads were dry," she said. "Is Mr. Voss here?" "He's at the ranch. He'll come into town tomorrow morning to finalize matters." Pratt held the door open. "Please come in. Can I get you water, something to eat?" "Water would be good." She sat across from his desk and drank the water and watched him trying to figure out what to say to her. He was a man who dealt in arrangements, in the careful management of expectations. And somewhere between her first letter and her arrival, the expectations had clearly diverged from reality in a way that was making him uncomfortable. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said finally, "I want to be straightforward with you. Please." "Mr. Voss he's a particular kind of man. He's built a significant operation here. The Voss Ranch is not a small concern. What he needs is—" He paused, choosing words. "What he communicated to me was that he needed a capable woman, someone who understood land and livestock, someone practical." "That's what I am," Evelyn said. "Yes." Another pause. "The town has certain expectations about the kind of woman who would come to be part of the Voss household." Evelyn set her glass down. "Mr. Pratt, I've been traveling for 4 days, and I heard a man laugh at me in the street before I even reached your door. I understand what the town expected. I'd like to know what Mr. Voss expects. Those are different questions." Pratt looked at her for a moment. Something shifted slightly in his expression, a small recalibration. "You're right," he said. "They are different questions." He arranged a room for her at the boarding house 2 doors down. The woman who ran it, a Mrs. Caldwell, was polite in the way of someone who had made a decision to be polite regardless of what she actually thought, which Evelyn found almost restful compared to the open laughter outside. The room was small and clean. The bed was narrow but firm. Evelyn unpacked her trunk, 3 dresses, 2 sets of practical work clothes, her husband's old almanac that she had kept for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, a small tin with letters from her sister in Ohio, and then she sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for the first time in 4 days, to feel uncertain. Not afraid. Uncertainty and fear were different things, and she had learned to keep them separate. But uncertain, yes. She had left everything she knew. She had come to a place where she knew no one, where the first sound that greeted her was laughter at her expense, where the man she was supposed to marry was an abstraction, a name in careful legal letters, a set of requirements, a business arrangement that 2 people had agreed to because they both needed something, and romance had nothing to do with it. She opened the almanac and read for a while. Old habits. She fell asleep before dark and slept better than she had in 4 days. Colton Voss arrived the next morning at 8 o'clock, and he was not what Evelyn had imagined either. She had constructed a picture from his lawyer's letters and from what little the letters revealed about the man behind them. Careful, controlled, accustomed to getting what he wanted, probably older. The man who walked into Aldous Pratt's office was 46, which she had known, but he wore it differently than she had pictured. He was not soft anywhere. Ranch work and hard weather had done something to him that no amount of wealth had undone, and he moved the way men moved who had spent their lives making physical decisions. Direct, economical, no wasted motion. He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a polite introduction required, and she looked back at him with the same directness, and neither of them pretended the moment wasn't happening. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Voss." They shook hands across Pratt's desk. His grip was a working man's grip, which she had expected. What she hadn't expected was that he didn't soften it for her. He shook her hand the same way he would have shaken another man's hand, and she found herself appreciating that more than she could have anticipated. Pratt offered coffee, and both of them accepted it and sat across from each other while Pratt moved papers around, trying to look busy. "You farmed," Colton said. It wasn't a question. He had read her letters. 40 acres in eastern Colorado. Wheat primarily, some cattle, a few hogs. My husband managed the cattle side. I managed everything else. "Why did you sell?" A direct question. She had expected something more circuitous, more polite. She answered it directly. "The land wasn't profitable. Thomas died 3 years ago, and I spent 2 years making it work, and the 3rd year understanding that making it work wasn't possible. The soil was depleted, and we didn't have capital to rest it properly." Colton turned his coffee cup in his hands. He was watching her the way she had seen good stockmen watch animals, not unkindly, but assessing, looking for soundness or weakness, for what the surface told you and what it was hiding. "The town's going to give you a hard time," he said. They already have. Something moved across his face. Not quite a wince, not quite acknowledgement. Gerald Winthrop. I don't know his name, tall man outside the mercantile. That's Winthrop. He and his family have land adjoining mine on the north side. He's been waiting for the Voss operation to collapse for approximately 15 years, and the waiting has made him mean. Colton set his cup down. He'll look for any weakness. All right, Evelyn said. You understand I'm telling you this because it's true, not to alarm you. I understand that. He looked at her again, that same direct assessing look. What do you want from this arrangement, Mrs. Hartwell? Not what you wrote in the letters. What do you actually want? It was the most honest question anyone had asked her in years, and she recognized it as such, and she thought about answering it carefully and then decided against careful. I want to work, she said. I want to be useful. I want to not spend the rest of my life watching something fall apart when I can see what needs to be done to fix it. I had that for the last 2 years of my marriage, and it was... She stopped, found the right word. It was a particular kind of misery? He nodded slowly, like someone who understood that kind of misery from his own direction. The ranch is in trouble, he said. It was the first time she had heard anything like difficulty in his voice. I won't hide that from you. It's not the kind of trouble that newspapers write about. It's slower than that. The herd numbers are down. We've had 3 bad breeding seasons. The land on the eastern portion isn't grazing the way it should. I have men who've been with me 20 years, and none of them can tell me why. He looked at the window rather than at her. I thought bringing in someone new might bring in a new way of seeing things. Evelyn felt something clarify inside her, the way a landscape clarifies when the morning fog burns off and you can finally see the actual shape of things. Can I look at the land? She said. That's why I'm here. They rode out to the Voss ranch that afternoon, Pratt trailing behind them on a borrowed horse and clearly wishing he were somewhere else. The ranch was larger than Evelyn had prepared herself for. Even knowing the numbers from the letters, seeing it was different. The house itself was substantial, built from timber and stone, sitting on a rise that gave it a view across several miles of grassland. The outbuildings were well constructed. Everything spoke of money spent over time, money that had gone into solid foundations rather than show. But she could see it within the first mile of riding the eastern pastures. The grass was wrong. Not dead. That was the thing that had probably confused everyone. It wasn't dramatic enough to look like failure. The cattle could eat it, and they were eating it, but they weren't thriving on it the way they should have been. The grass was surviving at a low level, producing just enough to keep the herd going without giving them what they needed to put on proper weight or breed well. She stopped her horse and looked at the ground for a long moment. The creek, she said. Colton pulled up beside her. What about it? Where does it run in relation to this field? He was quiet for a moment, then pointed. North edge runs along the fence line. Does it run the same as it used to? Same volume? A longer silence. She could see him thinking back, going through years of memory. No, he said slowly. It's lower than it was. I noticed it, but I thought it was a dry cycle. It might be, Evelyn said. Or something's changed upstream. The grass isn't getting enough water to root deeply. It looks like it's surviving, but it's shallow-rooted. The cattle are eating grass that's giving them maybe 60% of what they need. Colton stared at the field. He had been looking at this land for 20 years. He had walked it, ridden it, made decisions about it. He had hired men who knew cattle to study it. And in 30 seconds, this woman from Colorado had said something that none of them had said. He stopped. It might not be right, she said. I'd want to look at the whole creek line before I was certain. But you might be right. I might be. He turned to look at her, and for the first time since they had met, the careful assessing expression was replaced by something else. Something that was not yet trust. Trust took longer than one afternoon, but was at least the recognition that trust might eventually be possible, which was, Evelyn knew, exactly where things had to start. They rode back to the ranch house as the light went flat and gold across the hills, and the cook, a taciturn man named Decker who had been with Colton for 14 years, put supper on the table without ceremony or conversation, which suited everyone. Colton's foreman, a man named Ray Buford, ate with them and spent most of the meal watching Evelyn the way the rest of the town watched her, except Buford's look was calculating rather than contemptuous. He was trying to figure out what she knew. She understood that too. "You ever worked cattle before?" Buford asked, midway through the meal, in the tone of someone who had already decided the answer was no. "My husband worked cattle," she said. "I worked alongside him until I understood what he understood, and then I worked the sections he didn't have time for." Working alongside a husband and actually knowing cattle are different things. "They are," Evelyn agreed. "Would you like to talk about what I actually know, or would you prefer to assume what you already think?" Buford looked at her. Colton said nothing, but his hands went still on his silverware. "I'm asking a genuine question," Evelyn said, keeping her voice even, "because I'd rather have this conversation directly than spend 3 months working around it." The silence stretched for a moment. Then Buford picked up his fork again. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you know about breeding cattle." She told him. She told him what she knew, and what she had observed, and what she suspected about the eastern pasture, and she was careful to frame it as what she believed rather than what she was certain of, because certainty she had not yet earned. Buford listened. His expression did not change, but he listened, and that was its own kind of information. After supper, Colton showed her the account books. She had not expected that. She had thought the books would come later, if they came at all, after trust was established, after she had proven herself in some way. Showing her the books on the first day was either a test or a statement, and she was not entirely sure which. She spent an hour with them while Colton sat across the room and did not pretend to be doing something else. He watched her read. She let him. The picture that emerged from the numbers was slow and uncomfortable. Not a collapse, not a disaster, but a steady erosion that had been happening for 5 years and would, if it continued, become a disaster within another 3 or 4. Revenue was down. Expenses were not, because the herd required the same labor whether it was thriving or struggling. The cash reserves that had once been substantial had been drawn down to cover the gap. "The water," she said finally, setting the last ledger down. "If you're right about the water." "If I'm right about the water, fixing the eastern pasture will take 2 years to show in the numbers, maybe 3, but it's the foundation." She looked at him across the room. "The other problems can be managed while you wait for the foundation to come back. Some of the breeding decisions can be changed this season. The grazing rotation can be adjusted. But if the eastern pasture doesn't recover, none of the other adjustments will matter enough." Colton was quiet for a long moment. "You got all of that from one afternoon," he said. "I got a theory from one afternoon. I'd need more time to know if I'm right." "And if you're wrong?" She looked at him steadily. "Then we've wasted the time it took to check, and we go looking for a different answer. That's not the worst outcome." He stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark where his land was, and she waited without filling the silence with anything, because silence was sometimes the most honest thing you could offer a person. "My first wife died 8 years ago," he said, to the window. "Her name was Clara. She knew this land as well as I did, maybe better, in some ways. When she was gone, I thought—" He stopped. "I thought the knowing would transfer somehow, that I'd be carrying what she knew because we'd built it together." He turned from the window. It didn't work that way. Evelyn thought about Thomas, about the almanac in her trunk, about the particular grief of losing someone who knew things that couldn't be written down. "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't." They looked at each other across the room. Two people who had lost someone and rebuilt themselves into something more careful and more armored, sitting in a house that needed saving, in a town that had already decided what they thought about both of them. "I'll have Buford show you the creek line tomorrow," Colton said. "All right. And Mrs. Hartwell." He paused, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite an apology, but was the shape of one. "What Winthrop did yesterday, it wasn't acceptable." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't. It also won't be the last time someone does something like it." She looked at him directly. "Mr. Voss, I've been underestimated my entire adult life by people who thought they were telling me something I didn't already know. The only question is whether this place turns out to be worth staying for." He held her gaze. "And?" She picked up the last ledger and set it squarely with the others. Ask me again in 6 months, she said. The morning after Evelyn studied the account books, she was up before Decker had the stove going. She had her boots on and her coat buttoned by the time the kitchen was warm enough to see her breath indoors, and she stood at the window with a cup of water, not coffee, the coffee wasn't made yet, and looked out at the dark over the east section and thought about water. About the way it moved and the way it didn't. About what it meant when land that had been productive for 20 years quietly, gradually stopped being productive. And nobody noticed because the decline happened slowly enough that each individual year looked like an ordinary bad year rather than one more step in a direction. Decker came in at 5:30 and found her there and said nothing, which was his characteristic response to finding things he hadn't expected. He started the stove and started the coffee and moved around her with the efficiency of a man who had been working in this kitchen for 14 years and had developed strong opinions about the organization of it. She got out of his way and sat at the table with the almanac from her trunk, the one that had belonged to Thomas, looking at the sections on water tables and soil composition. She was still there when Colton came down at 6. He looked at the almanac and then at her. "You didn't sleep." "I slept 4 hours." She turned a page. "I want to look at the creek upstream today. Above where we were yesterday." "How far above?" "Far enough to find where the volume changed." She looked up. Something happened upstream. The volume in that creek didn't drop on its own. Water doesn't decide to slow down. Something redirected it or blocked it or changed the gradient above where we were riding. Colton poured coffee and sat across from her. He had the look of a man who had woken up to find someone else had already been awake for 2 hours thinking about his land and was deciding how he felt about that. She had come to recognize this look as something he would work through on his own if she didn't push it, which she didn't. "Buford knows that creek better than anyone," he said finally. "Then Buford should come with us." They rode out after breakfast, the three of them, Colton, Evelyn, and Ray Buford, who had arrived at the main house that morning with the same wordless efficiency he brought to everything, saddled and ready before anyone specifically told him to be, which suggested Colton had said something the previous evening that Evelyn hadn't been present for. She didn't mind that. She minded results, not processes. The creek in the lower section ran the way she had seen it the day before, moving, functional, but thin. Less than it should be for a waterway of this size. She had measured its width against the channel cut in the bank over years of higher flow, and the gap between the historic channel and the current water was visible once you knew to look for it. They rode upstream. It took 40 minutes of riding before the terrain changed in the way she had suspected it might, the land rising slightly, the creek narrowing as it moved through a section where the banks were closer together, and then, around a bend where a stand of cottonwoods had grown thick over what she estimated was the past 8 to 12 years, they found it. The beaver dam was not dramatic. That was the first thing she noticed. It was not the kind of structure that announced itself. It was built low and efficient, tucked into a natural narrowing of the creek, constructed from the cottonwood debris that the animals had access to in quantity. It had been there long enough that the pond behind it had developed its own small ecosystem. Cattails along the edges, different grass than anywhere else nearby, a stillness in the water that contrasted with the movement of the creek below. Buford stopped his horse and looked at it for a long time. "I'll be damned," he said. It was the most expressive she had heard him. "When did these cottonwoods get thick enough for beaver to work them?" she asked. Buford thought about it. 8 years? Maybe 10. We had a wet period in the early 70s that pushed a lot of growth along this stretch. He looked at the dam. "I knew there was a beaver sign up here. I didn't think about what it meant for the downstream volume." "Nobody would," Evelyn said without making anything of it. "You weren't looking for a reason the east section was failing. You were looking for everything else." Colton had not said anything. He was on his horse on the far side of the dam, looking at the pond behind it, and she watched him work through what he was seeing, the water that was here, that should have been there, that had been slowly starving his best grazing section for the better part of a decade while he hired men and consulted people, and none of them had ridden 40 minutes upstream to look at what was obvious once you were standing in front of it. "We can breach it," Buford said, "or redirect, cut a channel around it." "Redirect," Evelyn said immediately. "Don't breach it." Both men looked at her. "Breaching puts all the backed water downstream at once. This time of year, with the ground still absorbing, you'd flood the east pasture and accomplish the opposite of what you want. A redirection channel takes longer but moves the water back to its original path at a rate the land can receive. She looked at the dam. Also, beaver don't build once. If you breach it, they'll build again. A redirected channel gives the water a more attractive path, and they leave the dam alone because the pond stays. Buford turned to look at Colton. Colton was watching Evelyn. How long for the redirect? Colton said. Depending on the ground, 3 weeks of work, maybe 4. And then? And then the water goes back where it belongs and the east section starts recovering. The grass won't come back overnight. 6 months before you'd see meaningful change. A full season before the cattle condition reflects it. 6 months, Colton said. He was doing arithmetic she could see on his face. Or you continue at the current rate, she said, and in 3 years the east section is ungrazable, and the herd size that fits on your remaining viable land doesn't support this operation. She said it plainly, without drama, because the truth of it was plain, and drama would only make it harder for him to receive. He looked at the dam for another moment, then, start planning the redirect. That was how things began moving in a different direction on the Voss Ranch, not with a speech or a declaration, but with 2 words from a man who had decided to trust something he was still figuring out whether he trusted, which was the only honest way trust ever started. The weeks that followed were not easy in the way that things in stories were sometimes described as not easy, which usually meant they were difficult, but in an interesting and forward-moving way. They were not easy in the actual sense. The way work is not easy when it is tedious and physical and produces visible results slowly and requires doing the same thing multiple days in a row with no guarantee that the cumulative result will justify the individual efforts. Evelyn managed the redirect planning. She was not a civil engineer. She had not built water channels before in any formal capacity. What she had was 20 years of practical observation about how water moved through terrain, a particular attention to the way drainage worked on the Colorado farm, and Thomas's almanac, which had a section on irrigation principles that she read 4 times until she understood what it was actually saying rather than what the words appeared to say. She also asked questions. This was something she did without embarrassment, identifying people who knew things she didn't and asking them directly. She asked Buford about the specific soil composition along the redirect route. She asked Decker, who turned out to have spent 3 years on a Missouri River drainage crew before he came to Montana, about the gradient calculations for a channel of this width. She took what they knew and put it with what she knew and produced a plan that was imperfect in several ways she could identify and probably imperfect in additional ways she couldn't, which was the condition of most plans. Buford went over the plan with her one evening at the kitchen table. The 2 of them bent over a rough map she had drawn of the creek section with annotations, and he made 4 corrections that improved it substantially and said nothing about the corrections being corrections, just stated them as additions, which was his version of tact. It'll work, he said at the end. You think so? I think it's got a reasonable chance of working, he said, which was the closest Buford came to optimism. She had come to understand this about him and received it accordingly. Colton stood in the doorway of the kitchen during part of this conversation and said nothing, which she had also come to understand. He was a man who stated opinions when he had them and withheld them when he didn't. And on technical matters outside his direct experience, he had the unusual quality, unusual in men of his kind in her experience, of knowing the boundary between his expertise and his confidence and not routinely crossing it. The actual diversion work began in the 2nd week of November. The ground was cold but not yet frozen, which was the window she had identified as optimal, soft enough to dig, cold enough that the soil would compact cleanly without the mud that came with wetter conditions. She had 4 men on the channel work, Buford directing, Decker on the heavy digging, Cal doing whatever Decker pointed him at, and a seasonal hand named Forsyth who had been hired for fall work and had not yet left because Evelyn had asked Colton to keep him on through the channel project, which Colton had done without asking why, because by this point he had developed a working theory that her operational requests had reasons behind them, whether she stated the reasons or not. She worked alongside them most days. Not because the work required her specifically. Buford was running the channel project with the competence of someone who understood exactly what was needed, but because she was not a person who managed from a distance things she could manage from close up, and because she had learned on the Colorado farm that people work differently when the person who had planned the work was also willing to do the work, and the difference mattered. It was during the second week of channel work that Winthrop came back. He didn't come to the ranch this time. He came to town, to the mercantile, at a time when Evelyn was there picking up a list of supplies, an ordinary Wednesday errand, the kind that required no particular planning, and he came with two of his men, and he came with something in his manner that she had not seen before, which was a specific kind of preparation, the look of a person who had decided in advance what they were going to do. She was at the counter when he came in. She heard the door and heard his footsteps and identified them without looking, because she had been in enough rooms with enough different people to know what footsteps that came with intention sounded like. She kept her attention on the supply list. "Mrs. Hartwell," Winthrop said behind her, loudly enough that 3 other people in the store heard it. "Or is it Voss now? I can't keep track." She turned. He was standing in the center of the store with his men on either side, and the 3 people who had heard him, a woman Evelyn didn't know, the storekeeper's assistant, and an older man who was browsing near the door, had all oriented toward the sound, which was the effect Winthrop had intended. "It's Hartwell," she said. "Is there something I can help you with?" "I heard Colton's got his crew digging up the creek line on the north section," Winthrop said. "That true?" "We're doing water management work on the property, yes." Water management. He said it with a particular quality. Not quite mockery, not quite question. "That's a new name for it. In my experience, when a failing ranch starts digging up creek lines, it's usually a sign that they're trying to look busy rather than actually fix anything." The woman Evelyn didn't know turned her head slightly away, which was the particular form of attention that pretended not to be attention. The storekeeper's assistant found something to organize behind the counter. "Your experience may vary from mine," Evelyn said. She turned back to the counter. "I'm going to buy this ranch," Winthrop said. She turned back again. She looked at him directly. "Not as a threat," he said, with the tone of a man making a reasonable statement. "As an observation. Colton Voss has been running that operation into the ground for 5 years. You arriving hasn't changed the numbers. The numbers are what they are." He held her gaze. "A woman who's been here 2 months doesn't change 5 years of decline by digging in a creek." "I've been here 6 weeks," she said. 6 weeks. My point stands. Your point is that you've watched this ranch for 15 years, and you've been waiting for it to fail, and you're here to tell me that my presence won't prevent that." She kept her voice entirely even. "I heard you. Is there something you actually need from this store, or did you come in to deliver that message specifically?" His jaw tightened slightly. The evenness threw him. She could see it. He had been prepared for defensiveness or distress or anger, and the lack of any of those things required him to recalibrate. "I've made Colton offers before," he said. "Fair offers." "I imagine you have." "You might encourage him to consider them." "Mr. Winthrop," she said, "I'm going to finish getting my supplies and go back to the ranch and do the work that needs doing. If Colton wants to discuss your offers, he knows where to find you." She picked up the supply list. "Have a good afternoon." She turned back to the counter. She heard him stand there for a moment, heard the specific quality of a man deciding whether to escalate or absorb, and then she heard his footsteps moving toward the door. When the door closed behind him, the woman Evelyn didn't know looked at her openly for the first time and said quietly, "That was Gerald Winthrop." "I know," Evelyn said. "He's not an easy man to say no to." "He's a manageable man to say no to," Evelyn said. "You just have to not be afraid of what comes next." The woman looked at her for a moment with an expression that was more complex than simple admiration. It was the expression of someone reassessing a category they thought they understood. She told Colton about the encounter that evening, specifically and without dramatizing it. He listened with his hands still on the table, which was what he did when he was making himself not react until he had heard everything. "He's pushing earlier than I expected," Colton said. "He's heard about the creek work. He's worried it might accomplish something." "Are you worried it might not?" She thought about the honest answer. "I'm worried about 100 things. The redirect timeline, the soil drainage rate, whether the East Section grassroots system has enough integrity left to recover, or whether we waited too long, whether 6 months is enough, or whether it's a year." She met his eyes. "I'm not worried about Winthrop. He's a problem I understand the shape of." Colton studied her for a moment. How do you do that? He said. Do what? Separate things. Most people, when someone comes at them from one direction, everything else gets pulled into it. He seemed to look for the word. You just put it in its place. She thought about Thomas again, not for the first time. About the 2 years she had spent in Colorado trying to save 40 acres that couldn't be saved. About the specific discipline of managing your fear in a situation where fear was entirely reasonable but not useful. You learned to put things in their place because the alternative was having everything in every place at once, which made clear thinking impossible. Practice, she said. He nodded, accepting this as the full answer it was. The thing nobody talked about, in the weeks that followed, was the way the ranch itself was changing. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of change that announced itself in any single day. It was the accumulation of small adjustments that added up to a different operation without any single moment you could point to as the turning point. The breeding records that Evelyn had reorganized so that the performance of individual cattle could be tracked across seasons rather than just by herd average, which meant that poor performers were identifiable and could be culled without guesswork. The feed rotation she had worked out with Decker that reduced waste in the winter stores by a margin that wouldn't save the operation on its own, but that added up over a season to a number worth having. The way she had started a running log of the east section grass condition, once a week, walked and noted, every section marked against the previous week, so that when the redirect water eventually reached the field, there would be a baseline to compare against. Buford noticed. He said nothing about it for 3 weeks, and then, one morning when they were both checking the channel progress, he said, "You're building a record." "Yes," she said. "For what?" "For the next problem," she said. "There's always a next problem. When it arrives, what you know about the condition of things before it arrived is the only resource you have that the problem can't take from you." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the channel. Then, "My father kept a weather log. 40 years, every day. Rain, temperature, wind direction. When he died, we had 40 years of Montana weather in one place. Was it useful?" "To a farmer, it would have been invaluable," Buford said. "He was a rancher, so mostly it just made him interesting at dinner." He picked up the measuring rod they had been using to check the channel gradient. He was also usually right about what the weather was going to do. It was the most personal thing Buford had ever said to her, and she received it without making more of it, which was what it required. Cal was a different case. The boy, she had stopped thinking of him as a boy, or was trying to because he was 17 and doing man's work and deserved the accuracy, had started appearing in the vicinity of whatever she was doing with a frequency that was not accidental, not in a way that interfered with work, just present, listening. He had the quality of someone absorbing things he didn't have language for yet. One afternoon in late November, when the channel work was in its 3rd week and progressing ahead of the timeline she had estimated, he appeared beside her while she was checking the east section grass and said, without preamble, "How do you know what to look for?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The grass, the water. How do you look at it and know what it's telling you? I've been riding this land for 2 years and I just see grass and water." She thought about how to answer honestly. "You have to know what it looked like before," she said. "That's most of it. If you don't know what the baseline is, everything looks like it's supposed to be there. The records matter because they tell you what before looked like, so you can see when something is different. And if there aren't records, then you look at the land itself. What's thriving where there's no reason it should be thriving? What's failing where it shouldn't fail? Land keeps its own records if you know how to read them." She looked at the grass around them. "The beaver didn't appear in any record we had, but the creek knew about it. The grass knew about it. The cattle weights knew about it. We just weren't asking the right questions." Cal looked at the grass. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him looking differently than he had been looking before, trying to see record rather than scenery. "Can I help with the log?" he said. "The east section one." She looked at him. "Do you know what you're looking at?" "No," he said, "but I could learn." She handed him the notebook. "Week after next," she said. "Walk the south quadrant with me and I'll show you what I'm marking and why." He took the notebook with the particular care of someone who understood they had been given something that mattered. December came in hard, the way it did in Montana, the cold settling in from the north with the conviction of something that knew it would be staying for months. The channel work was finished by the first week of December. Not perfectly. Buford was specific about the two sections that were going to need adjustment when the spring ground softened, but functionally the redirect was in place. The water was moving, not reaching the east section yet. The gradient and the frozen ground between the redirect point and the field created a timeline that Evelyn estimated at spring, when the ground thawed and the water could spread through the restored channel bed. But the redirect was in place, and the beaver dam sat intact behind it, and the pond level was already beginning to drop slightly, which meant the dam's capacity to hold water was slowly being diminished, which meant the spring thaw would deliver something real. The night the channel work was officially complete, Decker made something approximating a celebration dinner. It was not explicitly called a celebration because nobody on the ranch called things celebrations. They were working people who were suspicious of ceremony. But the meal was considerably better than the ordinary evening meal, and Decker had made a pie of the kind that required more effort than pies usually received. And everybody ate more than usual and talked more than usual. And Cal laughed at something Buford said with the full-body laugh of someone who had finally relaxed his guard completely. Colton, at the head of the table, watched the room the way he sometimes watched things from a slight remove. Not outside the warmth of it, but not quite inside it either, in the way of a man who had gotten used to being at the edge of other people's ease. Evelyn, across from him, caught him watching, and he didn't look away, which was a different thing from the watching he had done when she first arrived. She had come, she understood, to know the difference. After the meal, the others drifted out and Decker cleared the table and they were left in the kitchen the way they usually were, the lamp between them, the account book, or the operational log open. The day's last accounting in progress. This was their rhythm now, after 12 weeks on the same ranch. She had not planned it. It had arrived through accumulated evenings of practical proximity. "The redirect's done," Colton said. "Yes." "Spring will tell us if it worked." "Spring will tell us if the theory was right," she said. "Whether it works depends on how we manage the east section through the recovery period. The water is the beginning, not the end." He looked at her steadily. "I know." And then, in the same even tone, "I don't know what this place would have looked like by spring if you hadn't come." She looked at the operational log on the table. She thought about what was true. You would have continued declining for another 2 or 3 years. And then one of two things would have happened. Either you would have found someone who identified the creek problem eventually and made the correction, or you would have been in a position where Winthrop's offer looked better than the alternative. That's not a good 2 options. "No," she said, "it's not." He was quiet for a moment. "In the letters," he said, meaning the letters she and Pratt had exchanged before she arrived, "you wrote that you wanted to be useful." "Yes." "I thought I understood what that meant." "And now?" He looked at the lamp rather than at her, the way he looked at things when the looking itself was the point, rather than anything he was going to say about it. "And now I think I was thinking too small," he said, "about what useful meant." She thought about the right thing to say to that, and decided that the right thing was nothing in particular, because he wasn't asking a question, and she wasn't someone who filled silences that didn't need filling. Outside the kitchen window, the Montana winter was absolute and thorough, and made no concessions to the preferences of the people in its way. The cold would be what the cold was, and spring would come when spring decided to, and the east section was going to tell them in its own time what the creek work had actually accomplished. She closed the operational log and set the pen down, and the evening wound toward its ordinary end. And the ranch outside was quiet in the way of things that were, despite the cold and the waiting and the uncertainty of the coming months, still standing. The first snow came 3 weeks earlier than anyone expected. Evelyn was standing at the creek line on the eastern boundary when the sky changed. Not gradually, the way Montana skies usually announce themselves, but all at once, like a door slamming in a house you thought was empty. One moment the air was cold but manageable, the kind of cold that bit at your ears and made your breath visible but didn't stop you from working. The next moment the wind shifted and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the space of a single exhale, and the clouds that had been sitting heavy on the northern horizon all morning were suddenly directly overhead. Ray Buford pulled his horse up beside her. He had been showing her the Upper Creek diversion, the one she had identified 3 weeks ago as the source of the water problem. The place where a beaver dam built up over 2 seasons had quietly redirected enough flow to starve the eastern pasture without anyone noticing until the grass told them what had happened. "We need to get back," Buford said. His voice had a quality she had learned to read over the past weeks. He didn't alarm easily. When he sounded like that, the alarm was real. "How long do we have?" "If that's what it looks like, maybe 2 hours before it hits hard. Could be less." She looked at the diversion work they'd started, the partial channel they'd cut to redirect water back toward the eastern fields, the work that had taken her 3 weeks to convince Colton was the right approach, and another 2 weeks to convince Buford to actually begin. It was maybe 40% done. The rest sat open, unfinished, in ground that would be frozen solid by morning. "The cattle in the east pasture," she said. 40 head still out there. Decker was supposed to move them this afternoon. She already knew from the way he said it that Decker had not moved them. Something had gone wrong with the plan that looked reasonable 2 hours ago when the sky was merely overcast. Ranch plans had a way of being reasonable until they weren't. She turned her horse and rode hard. The next hour was the kind of hour that compresses in memory, not because things happen slowly, but because they happen with such density that afterward you can't quite reconstruct the sequence. She reached the east pasture fence and found Decker there with 2 of the younger ranch hands, a boy named Cal, who was 17 and afraid to admit it, and an older hand named Marsh, who had bad knees and worked through pain as a matter of policy. They had gotten roughly half the cattle moving toward the gate. The other half had done what frightened cattle do in bad weather, scattered to the far end of the field and bunched against the fence line in a mass of noise and heat and stubborn, stupid animal panic. "They won't move," Decker said. He wasn't apologizing. He was reporting. "They'll move," Evelyn said. "We need more horses on the far side." "We don't have more horses on the far side." She had 4 riders, including herself. She had a field that was about to become impassable. She had 40 cattle who had made a collective decision to die against a fence rather than walk through a gate, because cattle did not weigh the long-term consequences of their decisions, and you could not explain the situation to them. "Cal," she said. The boy looked up. He had snow in his eyelashes already, tiny flakes that were coming faster than they should have been. "Car, can you ride the fence line on the outside, all the way to the far corner and come back along the south edge, loud as you can?" "Yes, ma'am." "Don't stop. Don't slow down. Just make noise and keep moving." He went. She positioned Marsh on the near side of the herd and herself on the left flank and Decker on the right, and when Cal's horse came crashing along the outside of the fence, making the kind of racket a 17-year-old could generate when he wasn't worried about looking foolish, the cattle at the back of the group moved. Not all of them, not gracefully. But they moved, and when the lead animals moved, the others followed because that was the one reliable thing about cattle. Their commitment to collective decision-making, even when the collective decision was wrong, meant that you only had to change a few minds to change all of them. They got 36 of the 40 through the gate before the snow hit in earnest. The remaining 4 scattered in 4 different directions, and Evelyn made a decision in the space of 2 seconds, chasing them into worsening conditions with tired horses and a crew that included a 17-year-old and a man with bad knees was not a decision she was willing to make. 4 cattle was real money. 4 cattle was not worth 4 people. "Leave them," she said. Decker looked at her. "They'll find shelter in the draw on the south end," she said, with more certainty than she actually had. "We'll look in the morning." She didn't know if they would find shelter in the draw. She was making a calculation about probability under conditions that didn't reward certainty, and she was doing it with other people's lives and other people's money. And the weight of that was something she carried the whole ride back to the ranch house, through snow that went from flurries to serious in the time it took them to cover 2 miles. Colton was on the porch when they rode in. She had learned his silences over the past weeks, the way he stood when he was angry versus when he was worried versus when he was simply waiting. The way he stood now was the third kind, waiting, but with something underneath it that was closer to the second. "East pasture?" he said. 36 inches, 4 scattered south. She dismounted. Her hands were cold enough that the reins felt unfamiliar. I made the call to leave them. All right. It might have been wrong. Might have been. He took her horse's reins from her without being asked. Get inside, Decker, Cal, Marsh. Get inside. She was almost to the door when he said, behind her, quietly enough that it wasn't for the others, You made the right call. She didn't answer. She went inside and stood by the stove and waited for the feeling to come back into her hands. What came in that night was not a winter storm in the ordinary sense of the term. It was the kind of storm that people in Montana talked about for years afterward, using it as a marker. Before the storm, after the storm, the way other communities used floods or fires or the deaths of important people. It came from the north with a seriousness of purpose that felt almost personal, driving snow horizontally across the grasslands and dropping temperatures to levels that killed anything that wasn't sheltered, and a few things that were. By midnight, the ranch house was an island. The outbuildings were still there. Evelyn knew they were there, but she couldn't see them from the window, and the sound of the wind was loud enough that you had to raise your voice inside to be heard clearly. The men had gathered in the main room, Buford, Decker, Cal, Marsh, and 2 other hands who had been in the bunkhouse but moved to the main house when the bunkhouse stove started losing the argument with the cold. Colton had opened his house to them without comment, the way a man does when the mathematics of survival are obvious, and there's nothing to say about them. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the ranch's supply inventory spread in front of her, doing arithmetic. 3 days, she said, when Colton came to look over her shoulder. At least. The hay stores in the north barn. How much of that got wet when the roof leaked in September? He was quiet for a moment. She had learned that his pauses meant he was actually thinking, not stalling. Maybe a third, he said. So we have roughly 2/3 of what we thought we had, for a herd that's going to need more feed than usual because they're burning calories staying warm. She ran the numbers again. It's close. How close? If it runs 4 days, we're short. If it runs 3, we might make it with careful rationing. Buford from across the room. There's hay at the Henderson place. I know for a fact they had a good cutting this fall. Henderson is 6 miles north, Colton said. The road might be passable day after tomorrow if the wind drops. The wind won't drop day after tomorrow, Colton said it flatly, without drama. He had lived here 20 years. He knew the way these storms moved. Henderson's not an option until this is over, and if we're short, we'll be short before it's over. Evelyn was looking at the map on the wall. She had been looking at it for 3 weeks, learning the land the way you learned it when your survival depended on actually understanding it, rather than just moving across it. The ranch's layout, the neighboring properties, the roads, the creek lines, the draws and rises. The Calloway place, she said. Silence. Mrs. Calloway, she said again, turning from the map. Her husband died in the spring. She's running that operation with her son, who is, 15? 14, Buford said. She's 2 miles east. She had a good hay season because the water on her land runs better than ours. And she's 2 miles east, which means the road between here and there runs sheltered along the ridge. She looked at Colton. She's also going to be alone in that storm with a 14-year-old boy and a cattle herd that isn't large enough to justify the outbuildings she's got, which means she probably has hay to spare and a serious problem keeping her own cattle alive through this. Colton was looking at the map now. You're talking about going out in this, he said. I'm talking about sending someone tomorrow morning if the wind drops enough to ride. Make her an offer, her hay, in exchange for our labor getting her herd through the storm. We have the men. She has the feed. And if she says no, then we've lost an hour and we're no worse off than we are now. Buford made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite agreement. It was the sound she had come to recognize as his version of being surprised by something. There's also the matter of what Winthrop is doing right now, Decker said, from his corner. The room went still in a way that was different from the previous stillness. Evelyn looked at Decker. He had said it to the room, but he was looking at her, which meant he was saying it for her benefit. He had decided she needed to know something. What about Winthrop? Colton said. I heard, before the storm, that he'd been talking to the bank in Billings, Talking to the man who holds the note on the Voss grazing rights on the east section. Decker set down his coffee cup. Talking about what happens if those grazing rights come up for renewal and nobody's in a position to negotiate. The east section grazing rights. Evelyn had seen them in the account books, a lease arrangement that had existed for 12 years that Colton had always renewed without difficulty because the ranch's financial position had always made it straightforward. She had also seen that the lease came up for renewal in 4 months, and she had noted it and filed it away as one of the ranch's coming pressure points, not yet urgent. Winthrop had apparently been doing his own accounting. "He can't buy the note," Colton said, but there was something under the flatness that wasn't quite certainty. "He can't buy the note," Decker agreed, "but if the man holding the note decides not to renew the grazing rights, and if those rights go back on open market, Winthrop has the cash to bid for them." "Without the east section grazing rights," Buford said carefully, to no one in particular, "the herd size we need to be profitable doesn't fit on what we own outright." "I know what it means," Colton said. Evelyn was still at the table. She was listening to all of it and doing a different kind of arithmetic. Not supply inventory now, but the larger calculation of what was actually happening around them. The storm was real and immediate and had to be managed. But the storm was also an opportunity for anyone watching from outside, anyone who understood that crisis created moments of vulnerability that normal conditions didn't. "When does the note holder come to Billings next?" she said. Everyone looked at her. "The man who holds the note on the grazing rights. When is he next in Billings?" "I don't—" Colton stopped. "I'd have to check. March, I think. He usually comes through in March." "March is before the renewal deadline." "Yes." "Then we need to be in front of him in March," Evelyn said, "with a financial picture that makes renewing our lease obviously preferable to selling the rights on open market, which means we need this ranch to look better in March than it looks right now." "We're in the middle of a blizzard," Buford said, not sarcastically. He was genuinely noting the obstacle. "We're in the middle of a blizzard right now," Evelyn said. "We won't be in March. What we do in this storm, how we manage it, whether we keep this herd alive, whether we come out of it with the operation intact, that's what March looks like. This isn't two separate problems." The wind hit the north wall of the house hard enough to make the lamp flicker. Cal, the 17-year-old, looked at the ceiling. Marsh rubbed his knees. Colton was looking at Evelyn with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, and she couldn't quite name it, which was unusual. She had gotten reasonably good at reading him. He pulled a chair to the table and sat down. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "All of it." She told him. She talked for the better part of an hour, the wind providing a constant background argument against the windows, the other men drifting closer until they were all around the table. Not because they had been invited, but because the conversation had become something that concerned all of them, and standing apart from it stopped making sense. She talked about the storm management, and the Callaway arrangement, and the March meeting, and the creek work that was 40% done and sitting frozen, and why finishing it in spring was actually more important than it had been 3 weeks ago. Because the east section's productivity was going to be the number the bankman cared about when he looked at whether to renew. She also said the things she wasn't certain about. She was specific about where her certainty ended and her best guessing began because she had seen what happened when people presented guesses as certainties and then the guesses were wrong. The collapse of credibility was worse than the original uncertainty would have been. Colton asked questions, good questions, the kind that found the weak points in her thinking. She answered what she could and said, "I don't know," about the things she didn't. And at one point, Buford asked a question that she actually hadn't thought of, about the road conditions between the ranch and the county seat and how that affected the timeline for any legal protection of the grazing rights. And she said so, directly, and wrote it down as something that needed answering. It was past 2 a.m. when the conversation wound down. The storm had not. "Callaway," Colton said finally. "First thing tomorrow, if there's any break, I'll write it myself." "Send Buford," Evelyn said. "She knows Buford. She doesn't know you well, and she's going to be scared, and a familiar face negotiates better than a strange one." Colton looked at Buford. "I know her," Buford confirmed. "Her husband and I ran a fence line together 3 years ago. She'll talk to me." "All right," Colton said. Buford goes. It was a small thing. deferring to her read of a social situation, acting on her assessment of who should walk through a door and why. But he had done it without the half-second hesitation that had characterized his responses to her ideas in the first weeks. The pause that meant he was deciding whether to accept the input from this particular source. The pause was gone. She noticed that. She went to bed at 2:30 and lay awake listening to the storm dismantle itself against the house. And she thought about the 4 cattle she had left in the south draw. And she thought about Gerald Winthrop sitting somewhere warm right now doing math about a lease that he believed would be the thing that finally broke what he'd been trying to break for 15 years. And she thought about Colton's face across the table in the lamplight and the quality of attention he gave to ideas when he was actually listening to them, which was different from the attention he gave to ideas he was tolerating. She thought about Thomas, too. She couldn't help that. She thought about the winter 3 years ago, when she had sat alone in the house in Colorado and listened to a storm and understood that she was on the wrong side of something she couldn't fix. The feeling now was nothing like that feeling. The difference was not that the storm was less dangerous. The difference was something she didn't have a clean word for. She fell asleep. The wind dropped at dawn, not gone, but reduced from a force that made thought difficult to merely a serious cold wind, the kind that required proper clothing and moving fast between shelter. Buford was up before the light was full and had a horse saddled and was gone before Evelyn had finished her first cup of coffee. She watched him go from the kitchen window, his figure disappearing quickly into the white that covered everything. Decker went to the barns. Cal went with him, moving with the particular energy of a young person who had discovered overnight that fear had not killed him, and the discovery had made him braver than he'd been the day before. Marsh stayed by the stove because his knees had made a final determination about the cold, and he had stopped arguing with them. Colton and Evelyn went out to check the cattle. The herd had made it through. Not comfortably. The animals were hungry and stressed, and the cold had taken something out of them that would need to be put back with careful feeding over the next week. But they were alive and upright, which was what mattered. The barn structure had held. One section of fence on the northwest corner had gone down under the weight of drifted snow, but nothing had gotten through it because nothing had been trying to get through it. The cattle had stayed bunched near the hay they could smell from the barn. The 4 from the east pasture were a different story. They rode south to the draw as soon as the light was good enough. Evelyn had spent the night calculating the probability, and her honest assessment, the one she had not said aloud because there was no value in saying it aloud, was maybe 50-50. The draw was sheltered, but it was not a barn, and the temperature had been serious, and cattle caught in serious cold without shelter had a way of deciding to stop. They found 2 of the 4 alive, huddled together in the deepest part of the draw where the rock walls cut most of the wind. They found the other 2 50 yards away, which told her what she needed to know about which animals had made the decision to stay put and which had made a different decision. She looked at the 2 dead cattle in the snow and felt the weight of the calculation she had made the night before. The one she still believed was right, the one that would still have been right even if all 4 had survived, because the alternative was sending people into conditions that could have killed them for animals that might die anyway. A correct decision that resulted in a bad outcome was still a correct decision. She believed that. It was harder to believe at 7 in the morning looking at 2 dead animals in the snow, but she believed it. Could have been worse, Colton said beside her. Yes. You made the right call last night. 2 of them died, and 4 people are alive, and 36 more cattle made it through. He said it without inflection, like arithmetic. I've lost more than 2 in a storm when I made every right decision. Sometimes the outcome is the outcome. She looked at him. You don't have to say that. I know I don't. He turned his horse back toward the barn. Come on. Buford should be back by noon. Buford came back at 11:30 with Martha Calloway riding behind him. Evelyn had expected news of an arrangement, not the woman herself, and she watched from the porch as Martha Calloway dismounted in the ranch yard. A woman about Evelyn's age, maybe a few years younger, with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been holding a large thing together through a night that made holding anything together very difficult. She had her son with her, the 14-year-old, who was trying to carry himself like a man and not quite managing it, which was exactly right for 14. Mrs. Voss, Martha said, and then stopped, looking uncertain about the address. Hartwell, Evelyn said. We haven't formally... It's Evelyn Hartwell. Please come inside. They sat at the kitchen table. the same table where, 8 hours earlier, Evelyn had laid out the arithmetic of the ranch's survival to a room full of tired men. Martha Calloway's version of the arithmetic was different in specifics, but identical in structure. She had hay, more than she needed for her own herd, stored in a good dry barn, because her late husband had built barns the way some men built houses, with structural pride. What she did not have was enough hands to keep her cattle moving through 3 or 4 more days of serious weather. "I'll send 2 men," Colton said. He was leaning against the kitchen wall, letting Evelyn manage the conversation because he had understood, without being told, that this was one of those situations where his presence was useful, but his words were not what was needed. 3, Evelyn said. Decker and Cal and Marsh. Marsh can't work in this cold. Marsh can tell Cal and Decker what to do, and Cal and Decker can do it. Marsh knows cattle management better than anyone on this ranch. His knees are bad. His mind is fine. Martha Calloway was watching this exchange with the look of someone recalibrating a situation faster than she had expected to need to. She had come here to negotiate. She appeared to be discovering that the negotiation had already been conducted by someone who had thought about it before she arrived. "Her hay for our labor," Evelyn said, directly to Martha. "Whatever we can't use here, you keep. Whatever you need moved or managed through the rest of this storm, we provide the hands. And after? After, we're neighbors who helped each other through a hard week. That's worth something going forward, I think." Martha Calloway looked at her for a long moment. She was not a woman who made decisions carelessly. Evelyn could see that in the way she held things before responding, turning them over, checking the angles. "I've heard about you," Martha said. "I expect so. The things I heard weren't kind. They usually aren't. What I'm seeing is somewhat different from what I heard." Martha wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "All right, send your men. I'll have the hay over by wagon the day after tomorrow if the road clears." "The road will clear," Evelyn said, with the same kind of certainty she hadn't had about the cattle in the draw. This certainty was better founded. She had looked at the map long enough to know the road. After Martha and her son left, with Decker, Cal, and Marsh following on their horses, Marsh sitting his saddle with the deliberate care of someone managing pain as a logistical problem, the ranch house was quiet for the first time in almost 20 hours. Colton stood in the kitchen doorway. He was looking at Evelyn in a way she had learned not to deflect from, because deflecting from it was its own kind of dishonesty. "Winthrop's going to hear about this," he said. "He probably heard about the storm before we did," Evelyn said. "He's been watching this ranch for 15 years. He has sources. He'll hear that we weathered it. Yes. That won't make him less dangerous." "No, but it'll change what he thinks is possible." She started clearing cups from the table, partly because it needed doing and partly because she needed to do something with her hands. A man who believes his target is falling apart approaches differently than a man who sees the target is still standing. We need him to adjust. An adjusted opponent makes different mistakes. Colton was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn to think like that?" She considered the question. It deserved an honest answer, not a modest deflection. "Hard winters," she said. 2 years of running something I knew was failing and trying to find a way to make it not fail. You learn to see the whole board when you can't afford to lose any piece of it." He nodded slowly. He did not say anything else because sometimes a nod was the more complete response. The second night of the storm was quieter. The wind came back in the small hours, but without the first night's conviction, a diminishing argument rather than an assault. By the following morning, the sky had changed in a way that Colton identified, walking out onto the porch at 6 as meaning it was over. He was right. By midday, the temperature had come up enough to make outdoor work possible, and by afternoon, the road to the east was passable, and the wagon from the Calloway place arrived with hay, and Martha's son driving, and a look on the boy's face that suggested Decker had put him to work in a way he hadn't expected and hadn't altogether hated. The hay was enough. It was close. She ran the numbers twice to be certain, but it was enough. On the third day after the storm, Gerald Winthrop rode into the ranch yard. He came alone, which was either confidence or a calculation. Evelyn was in the yard when he arrived, working with Buford on the fence section that had gone down under the snow, the two of them having a disagreement about the right way to reset the corner post that had been the structural failure point. She saw Winthrop coming up the road, and she kept working because stopping work to watch someone approach was a form of greeting she was not interested in offering him. He pulled up at the edge of the yard and looked at the repaired fence and then looked at her. "Heard you had a rough few days," he said. "We managed," Evelyn said. She didn't look up from the post. "Lost some cattle, I heard." "2. Storm took 2. "Only 2. He said it with the tone of a man who had expected a larger number and was deciding what to do with a smaller one. "Surprised you knew how to handle a Montana winter." "Colorado winters are similar." She finally looked up. "Was there something you needed, Mr. Winthrop, or did you ride 6 miles to inquire about our cattle count?" His expression tightened slightly. He had expected, she could see it, to find something here that looked like a ranch that had been through a bad storm and showed it. What he had found was a fence being repaired, a yard that had been cleared, and a woman who was not behaving like someone who had barely survived. "I know about the grazing rights," he said. He had apparently decided that subtlety was not serving him. "Most people in the county know about the grazing rights," Evelyn said. "They've been on record for 12 years. The renewal." "March," she said pleasantly. "We're aware." Something shifted in his face. He had come here expecting to find a position he could exploit, to see disarray, fear, the particular vulnerability of people who had been battered and hadn't yet figured out where they stood. He was finding instead a woman who had been told about his play and was not alarmed by it. "You've been busy," he said, and there was an edge under it that wasn't quite a compliment and wasn't quite a threat. "There's a lot to do," Evelyn said. "Ranch this size, a lot to do." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Buford, who had been silent and attentive throughout, and whose expression conveyed nothing at all, which in itself was a kind of message. Winthrop turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Buford watched him go. Then he picked up the post driver and handed it to Evelyn without comment, which was his version of a number of different things, and she accepted it and went back to work. Colton had seen the conversation from the window of the house. When Evelyn came inside at dusk, he was at the table with a letter in front of him. A letter he had drafted, in his careful, precise handwriting, to the man in Billings who held the note on the East Section grazing rights. He had written it requesting a meeting in February, a month earlier than the man usually came through, at whatever location was convenient for the note holder. He slid the letter across the table toward her without saying anything. She read it. It was direct and reasonable, and made no concessions to the vulnerability of their position, which was exactly right, because conceding vulnerability in a letter like this was the same as asking the other man to exploit it. "One addition," she said. "What?" "Include the water work, the creek diversion. Tell him it's underway and what the projected outcome is for the East Section's productivity. Give him a number." "The work is 40% done." "The work is underway," she said. "That's true. And the projected outcome is real even if we haven't achieved it yet. He needs to see that this ranch is moving forward, not just surviving." Colton looked at the letter. He picked up his pen. He added a paragraph. She watched him write, and she thought about the storm that had just passed, and the storm that was still coming in the form of Gerald Winthrop, and the March meeting, and the East Section, and all the work that the next 4 months required, and she thought that there was a particular kind of tired that was different from the ordinary kind. The tired that came not from doing too much, but from finally being somewhere that required everything you had, and finding that what you had was improbably enough. She did not say any of that. She waited for him to finish writing. "Send it tomorrow," she said when he set the pen down. "First mail," he said. Outside, the last of the storm's clouds were moving south, and the stars were coming out over the Voss Ranch in the cold, clear sky, and somewhere in the south draw, whatever the storm had taken was already covered in snow, and whatever it had left was already finding its way back toward the barn. The letter reached Billings in 8 days. The reply came back in 12, which was faster than Colton had expected, and faster than Evelyn had hoped for, because fast replies to requests like that one generally meant the other party had been thinking about the subject already and had opinions formed before your letter arrived. The reply was brief and professional and agreed to a meeting in the 3rd week of February at the note holder's office in Billings rather than at the ranch, which told Evelyn something about how the man positioned himself in negotiations. On his own ground, behind his own desk, with the full weight of the institutional setting working for him before a single word was spoken. The man's name was Howard Greel. He had held the note on the East Section grazing rights for 6 years, having acquired it from a territorial bank that had restructured its portfolio after a difficult period. He was not, from what Colton knew of him, a vindictive man or a greedy one in the obvious sense. He was a careful man who made decisions based on numbers and risk assessments, which in some ways was harder to deal with than greed. Greed had angles you could work. Careful arithmetic was simply what it was. "He's been approached," Evelyn said when she read the reply a second time. Colton looked up from across the table. "You don't know that. The speed of the reply, the location. He's already been thinking about the renewal because someone else has been talking to him." She set the letter down. "Winthrop moved faster than I thought. Or it's coincidence." She looked at him. He made a small conceding gesture with one hand. He didn't actually believe it was coincidence either. He had just wanted to say it. The weeks between the storm and the February meeting were the most concentrated period of work Evelyn had experienced since she arrived at the Voss Ranch, and her arrival had not been short on concentrated work. The creek diversion was the priority. The ground had softened enough by late January to resume the channel cutting, and she was out there most mornings with Buford and whoever else could be spared, working in cold that was serious but no longer dangerous, trying to get the water moving the way it needed to move before the spring thaw made the east section's condition readable from the outside. The problem was that the diversion work was not going to show results in time for the February meeting. The grass would not visibly recover for months after the water pattern changed. She had known this from the beginning. What she needed was a way to present a future that was credible enough to compete with whatever Winthrop was offering in the present. She asked Colton one evening in late January whether he trusted his own memory. He looked at her oddly. "About what?" "About the creek. About what the water level was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whether you can be specific." "I can be specific," he said slowly. "But I'd need to think about it carefully. Why? Because if we can establish what the water level was and when it changed, we can show Greel that the east section's decline wasn't a permanent condition of the land. It was a specific problem with a specific cause that is being corrected. That's a different conversation than asking him to take our word for it that things will improve." Colton thought about this for a long moment. Then he went to a cabinet in the back of the study and came out with a wooden box that was heavier than it looked and set it on the desk, and Evelyn understood from the way he set it down that he had not opened it in some time. Inside were ranch records going back 22 years. Not the financial ledgers she had already reviewed. Those were kept separately in a more organized system. These were the operational records, handwritten in different hands over different periods, notes about water levels and grass conditions and cattle weights and weather patterns. Some of them were in Clara's handwriting, which Evelyn recognized from a single letter she had found tucked inside one of the financial ledgers early in her time here. She had returned the letter to its place without reading it, but the handwriting was distinctive. She spent 4 evenings going through those records. What emerged was exactly what she had hoped and had not been certain she would find. The creek volume references appeared across different records in different years, noted incidentally, the way water was always noted incidentally in ranching records because water was so fundamental that you only wrote about it when something changed. The notes from 14 years ago described water levels that were substantially higher than what she had observed when she arrived. The notes from 9 years ago began describing something slower, less reliable. The notes from 5 years ago, written in Ray Buford's handwriting, she recognized it now, mentioned twice that the east section water was running lower than usual, framed as a weather observation, a dry spell that would presumably correct. It had not corrected. It had continued declining. And the timing corresponded precisely with when the Beaver Dam would have begun its work upstream, based on the growth rate and the physical evidence she and Buford had found when they first inspected the diversion site. She built a document. She was not a lawyer and she had no formal training in this kind of presentation, but she had spent enough years managing a farm's paperwork, the letters and invoices and contracts and receipts that constituted a working farm's history, to understand how to organize evidence so that it told a story a careful reader could follow. She laid out the water level references chronologically. She noted the correlation with the east section's declining productivity. She included a description of the beaver dam and its location and the diversion work already underway, and she included Buford's estimate of when the restored water flow would produce measurable grass recovery. She showed it to Colton on the 5th day of February, 2 weeks before the meeting. He read it slowly and carefully, the way he read everything, and he didn't speak until he reached the last page. "This is good," he said. "It's a starting point. Greal will have questions we haven't anticipated." "Where did you learn to write something like this?" She thought about it honestly. "My father managed a small land operation in Ohio when I was young. He wasn't educated formally, but he kept records the way a cautious man keeps records, which meant keeping them the way they'd need to look if someone ever questioned them. I helped him with the paperwork from the time I was 12. She paused. "I didn't know I was learning anything. I thought I was just helping my father." Colton was quiet for a moment, looking at the document. "My father kept records the way a careless man keeps records," he said. "I spent the first 5 years after he died trying to reconstruct what had actually happened on this land so I'd know what I actually owned." It was the most he had told her about his history in a single statement, and she understood that it was not a casual offering. She received it without making a production of it. "We should also talk to Martha Calloway before we go to Billings," Evelyn said. "She grazes a section that borders the east pasture on the southern edge. If Winthrop gets those grazing rights and decides to manage them adversarially, it affects her operation too. She should know what's at stake." "You want her at the meeting?" "I want her in a position where, if Greal asks whether the broader ranching community in this area has concerns about how those rights are managed, the answer is documented and credible." She met his eyes. One ranch asking for a renewal is a financial request. Multiple ranchers explaining a pattern of land stewardship is something closer to a record. Colton put the document down. He looked at her for a moment with the expression that she had finally found a name for in the weeks since the storm. It was the expression of a man who was used to being the smartest person in his own territory and had discovered, with something between relief and disorientation, that he was not the smartest person in the room when she was in it, and was still working out exactly how he felt about that. "I'll ride to Calloway's tomorrow," he said. "She'll respond better to me," Evelyn said, not unkindly. A pause. "You're probably right." She rode to Martha Calloway's the following day through cold that had settled into the comfortable range, cold enough to keep the ground firm and the mud suppressed, but not the kind of cold that made every breath a negotiation. Martha was in her barn when Evelyn arrived, doing exactly what Evelyn would have been doing, checking the condition of the hay that had come through the storm and calculating what she still had against what she still needed. The conversation took 2 hours. Martha Calloway was not a woman who accepted propositions quickly, which Evelyn respected. She asked the right questions and sat with the answers before moving to the next question, and she was particularly sharp on the question of what Winthrop would do with the grazing rights if he acquired them. "He'd fence them," Martha said. It wasn't a question. "That would be my expectation," Evelyn said. "His strategy with land has been consistent. He acquires access rights and restricts them, which forces neighboring operations to route cattle differently. Longer routes, higher costs. Over time, it makes the neighboring operations less viable." "He tried to buy my husband's eastern section 3 years ago," Martha said. "James wouldn't sell. 2 months later, the road that ran along that section had a dispute about right-of-way that took 8 months to resolve. The dispute turned out to be manufactured, but by the time it was resolved, we'd spent more on the legal end than the section was worth to us in a year." Evelyn looked at her. "Did you document that?" "James kept every letter. He kept everything." Martha was quiet for a moment. "I haven't gone through his papers yet. It's been difficult to go through his papers." "I understand." Evelyn waited. "But if those letters document a pattern of behavior, they're worth knowing about." Martha nodded slowly. "Give me a week." She gave her a week. On the 8th day, a boy from the Calloway Ranch arrived at the Voss house with a packet of letters tied with kitchen twine and a note from Martha in her own handwriting that said, "I found more than I expected. Use what helps." Evelyn went through those letters over 2 evenings while Colton read alongside her, and what emerged from James Calloway's careful record-keeping was a pattern that went back 11 years. A consistent practice of manufactured obstacles, right-of-way disputes, water access complaints filed and then withdrawn, range inspection requests made to county offices that created delays and costs without ever producing findings. None of it was individually damning. All of it, assembled in sequence, was a portrait of a man who used institutional machinery as a weapon while keeping his own hands clean. "He's been doing this for longer than I thought," Colton said on the second evening. "He's been doing it to everyone around you," Evelyn said. "You were the primary target, but the surrounding operations were the mechanism. Make the neighbors difficult enough, and the center becomes isolated." Colton set down the last letter. He was silent long enough that she let the silence run. "I've been fighting him directly for 15 years, he said, finally, pushing back against individual moves, winning some, losing some. He looked at the stack of letters. "I've been fighting the wrong thing." "You've been fighting what you could see," Evelyn said. "That's not the same as fighting wrong." "What's the difference from where I'm sitting?" She thought about how to say the next part honestly. "The difference is that what you did for 15 years bought time. This place is still here. The operation is smaller than it should be, and under more pressure than it should be, but it's here." She looked at him steadily. "What we do in the next 3 weeks is use the time you bought." He picked up the stack of letters and tapped them even against the table, the way a man does when he is organizing his thoughts through physical action. "I'll need a lawyer in Billings," he said. "Yes. Not the one I've used before. Someone who knows land law specifically." "I asked Pratt for a name last week," Evelyn said. "He gave me 2. I've already written to both of them." He looked at her. Something crossed his face that was almost amusement, except more serious than amusement. "You wrote to them before we decided we needed one." "I wrote to them before we decided," she said, "because land law attorneys in Billings have calendars and February is short." The meeting with Howard Greele was on a Thursday in the 3rd week of February. They rode to Billings in 2 days, staying the first night at a way station that was clean enough and warm enough and required no particular conversation, which suited them both. The attorney Pratt had recommended, a man named Silas Dorn, met them in Billings and spent the evening before the meeting going through everything Evelyn had assembled, making notes in the margins with the rapid efficiency of someone who had read a great many documents and knew quickly what was useful and what wasn't. "The Calloway letters are the strongest piece," Dorn said, midway through. "A pattern of interference over 11 years from the same party who is now positioned to acquire your grazing rights is... That's not an argument about the present transaction. That's an argument about the integrity of the process by which this party is operating." "Can we use them?" Evelyn asked. "In a legal filing, they'd need more foundation. In a meeting like tomorrow's, but a meeting where you are trying to persuade a note holder that renewing your lease is in his interest rather than taking the alternative, yes. You're not proving a case. You're telling a story about risk." Dorn set the papers down. "Mr. Greele is a careful man. Careful men don't like being in the middle of something that looks straightforward but turns out to have history attached to it. Show him the history." Colton said almost nothing throughout this conversation. He was listening, which Evelyn had come to understand was what he did when he had decided he was not the most useful voice in the room, a decision he made with less resistance now than he had 3 months ago. Greele's office occupied the 2nd floor of a stone building on Billings' main commercial street, the kind of office that communicated stability and permanence through the quality of its furniture and the organization of its shelves. Greele himself was 50-something, compact, with the close manner of someone who gave away little and weighed what he received carefully before accepting it. He shook hands with Colton and with Dorn, and then he looked at Evelyn, and something shifted slightly in his expression, a recognition that she was not there in a social capacity, which required a small adjustment in how he was reading the meeting. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said after Colton introduced her. "You manage the ranch's operations?" "I work alongside Mr. Voss on the operational side," she said. "I've been particularly involved in the land recovery work." "The diversion project," Greele said. He had done his reading. "Yes." She met his gaze. That's where I'd like to start if you're willing. He was willing. He was a careful man, but he was not an incurious one, and what she presented him was something specific enough to be interesting to a careful man. Not optimism, not promises, but a documented trajectory, a before and an after, a cause that had been identified, and a correction that was underway, and a realistic timeline for what the numbers would look like when the correction was complete. She showed him the operational records. She showed him the water level references across 22 years. She showed him the document she had built, and she watched him read it the way she had watched Colton read it, slowly, going back to check things, comparing one page against another. Then she set the Callaway letters on the table. She explained them quietly and specifically, where they came from, what they documented, the 11-year pattern. She did not characterize Winthrop by name in heated terms. She simply described what the letter showed, and she let Greal read 3 of the most specific ones himself. Greal was quiet for a long moment when he set the last letter down. "You're telling me," he said, "that the alternative party who has expressed interest in these rights has a documented practice of using access rights as instruments of interference with neighboring operations." "I'm showing you letters that document a pattern," Evelyn said. "What it means is your assessment to make." "A note holder who assigns grazing rights to a party with that history," Dorn said, from beside her, measured and professional, "becomes part of the story that history belongs to. That's not a comfortable position for an institution that values its reputation for straightforward dealing." Greal looked at Dorn. He looked at the letters. He looked at Evelyn. "The renewal rate," he said. "What are you proposing?" Dorn named a figure. It was fair. Not aggressive, not concessive. Evelyn had helped calculate it, working from the projected East Section productivity numbers and what the land would reasonably support while the recovery completed. Greal looked at the number and looked at his own papers and was quiet for a period that felt longer than it probably was. 5-year renewal, Greal said. Same rate. With a review provision at 3 years if the East Section productivity documentation doesn't meet the projection. 3.5 years, Dorn said. The water recovery timeline makes 3 unreliable. A pause. 3.5, Greal agreed. Evelyn allowed herself exactly nothing on her face. Beside her, she was aware of Colton being very still. They were out of Greal's office by noon. On the street outside, Dorn shook hands with both of them and said he would have the paperwork drafted within the week, and they should review it carefully before signing anything, and then he walked off toward his own office with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had other afternoons to manage. Colton and Evelyn stood on the street in Billings in the thin February light. 5 years, he said. 5 years, she said. He looked down the street and then back at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything because sometimes what had just happened needed a moment before words were the appropriate response to it. He was approached by Winthrop, Colton said. Clearly. Winthrop offered him more money? Almost certainly. And we won anyway. We gave him a better argument than money, Evelyn said. Money is common. The argument we gave him was specific to this situation in a way that made the alternative look like a problem rather than an opportunity. She paused. He's a careful man. We gave him a careful reason. They had lunch at a restaurant on the main street, a real meal rather than trail food, and it was the first time Evelyn could recall sitting across a table from Colton Voss in a public setting where they were not performing anything, not conducting business, not managing someone else's perception of them, not being observed by people who had opinions about their arrangement. They were simply 2 people who had just accomplished something difficult together and were now eating lunch. It was, she realized, pleasant. That was the word. Not dramatic, not overwhelming. Pleasant. She hadn't had a great deal of pleasant recently, and she received it without making too much of it. Colton ordered pie after the meal. He ate approximately half of it and then pushed it toward the middle of the table without comment, and she took the fork he'd been using and ate the other half, and neither of them remarked on this either. They rode back the following day. The weather held, cold and clear, the kind of February day that reminded you that spring was an eventual certainty rather than an immediate one, but a certainty nonetheless. They made good time and reached the ranch before dark on the second day, and the yard was quiet when they rode in, Buford coming out of the barn to take their horses with the expectation on his face of a man who had been managing something in their absence and was ready to report. Winthrop's men were on the north fence line 2 days ago, Buford said, counting cattle. Colton took this in. Counting. Just looking, didn't cross the line. But they stood there for a good half hour, and nobody does that for no reason. He knows we went to Billings, Evelyn said. He's got sources everywhere, Buford agreed. Want me to start keeping a log of when they appear? Evelyn looked at Colton. He looked at her. Yes, she said. Date, time, location, number of men, what they were doing, written down the same day. Buford nodded. He'd been on this ranch for long enough that the instruction didn't require explanation. He understood what a written log was for. Inside the house, Decker had kept supper warm. Cal had apparently made some attempt to clean the kitchen, which was visible in the effort rather than the result. Marsh was by the stove with his feet up, reading an old newspaper with the concentration of someone who had read it before and was looking for things he'd missed. It was, Evelyn thought, looking at the room. The warm fire, Decker's supper, Cal's imperfect cleaning, Marsh's newspaper. A household. Not a perfect one. Not an elegant one. A working one, with the slightly disorganized warmth of people who had been through something difficult together and were still here. She had not expected to feel that. She sat at the table and accepted a plate from Decker and ate. And Colton came and sat across from her and ate. And gradually the others drifted around the table the way they had started to do over the past months. Not formally invited, not formally included, just present. Because the table had become the place where the business of the ranch was understood and discussed, and the men who worked it had figured out that being near the table was worth more than being elsewhere. 5-year renewal, Colton said, at a moment when the table was quiet enough to hear it. Buford set down his cup. Decker made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Cal said, "That's good, right?" And Marsh told him quietly that, yes, that was good. And Cal nodded as if he had known that and just wanted confirmation. Evelyn looked at her plate. She was tired in the specific way that followed accomplished difficulty rather than failed effort, the tiredness that was almost pleasant because of what it came from. "The east section work resumes Monday," she said. "We need the channel finished before the thaw makes the ground soft again. Once the water's moving right, we'll start seeing grass response by April." "April," Buford repeated, as if placing it on a calendar. "Maybe May," she said honestly. "I said April, so we'd push for April and be satisfied with May." Buford almost smiled. She had come to understand that almost smiling was, for Buford, the full expression. After the meal, Colton stayed at the table while the others went to the bunkhouse or to their beds, and he opened the account ledger that lived on the sideboard and set it between them without either of them deciding to do it. It just happened, the way the end-of-day accounting had become a shared habit in the months since she had first studied those books on her second evening at the Voss Ranch. He updated the lease status in his careful handwriting. 5-year renewal, February 1884. She watched the entry go in. "There's something I should have said," he began, and then stopped. She waited. "When you came here," he said, looking at the ledger rather than at her, "I thought this arrangement was... I thought what I needed was someone practical, someone to manage things. I didn't think beyond that." "That was what the arrangement was," she said. "It became something else." He looked up. I don't say things of this kind easily." "I know. What you did. With the water, with the storm, with the Calloway letters, and the meeting with Greal." He put the pen down. "None of that was what I hired you for. That was more than what I asked for. Considerably more." She looked at him directly. "You asked for someone practical. I was being practical." "Evelyn." He said her first name, which he used rarely and with a care that always made it feel like a specific choice. "You saved this ranch." The word hung in the room for a moment. She thought about what to say to that. She thought about Thomas and the almanac in her trunk and the 40 depleted acres she had sold for less than they were worth to a buyer who had known it. She thought about Gerald Winthrop's laughter on the street in Granger's Bluff on the afternoon she arrived, and the way she had walked away from it without looking back. Not because it didn't hurt, but because looking back was not a useful thing to do. "The ranch isn't saved," she said finally. "The grazing rights are secured for 5 years. The water work isn't finished. The east section isn't recovered. The breeding numbers are better than they were, but they're not where they need to be." She kept her voice level but not cold. "We have 5 years to make this operation what it needs to be. We've bought the time." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not going to let me say thank you." "I'm letting you say it," she said. "I'm giving you an accurate picture of what it's for." Something moved across his face that was more than the almost amusement she had seen before. "Claire used to do that," he said quietly. "Wouldn't let me round up." "It's a bad habit in ranching," Evelyn said. "Rounding up." He picked the pen back up. He made a few more entries. The lamp between them was steady and unhurried, the fire in the grate settling into its late evening rhythm. "In the spring," he said without looking up from the ledger, "when the east section starts coming back, I'd like you to be here to see it." She looked at him. He was still looking at the ledger. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He made one more entry. He closed the ledger. Outside, the night was clear and hard and cold over the Voss Ranch, and Gerald Winthrop was somewhere in it doing his own accounting, and the spring was 3 months away, and the east section was waiting for water it was about to receive, and 5 years was a long time if you used it correctly. And Evelyn Hartwell, who had arrived unwanted on a stage from Colorado, had discovered that the question she had given Colton Voss on her second day here, "Ask me again in 6 months," had answered itself in a way she had not entirely foreseen, and that the answer was something she intended to keep. The creek diversion was finished on the 14th of March, on a Tuesday, in cold that had softened enough to make the work possible, but not enough to make it comfortable. Evelyn was there when they cut the last section of channel and the water found its new path. It didn't happen dramatically. No rush of current, no visible transformation. The water simply moved, quietly and without ceremony, the way water always moved when you gave it the right direction. Buford stood beside her and they both looked at it for a moment, and then Buford said they should get back to the barn because the post work on the south fence wasn't going to finish itself, and Evelyn said yes, and they rode back. That was how most things actually happened. Not like stories. Like work. But she marked the day in the ranch's operational log the way she marked everything now. Specific, dated, factual. The water was moving. The east section would tell them the rest in its own time. What the east section told them by April was that the theory had been correct. The grass came back slowly and then less slowly, the way grass did when the root system was sound, and had simply been water-starved rather than dead. By mid-April, there was visible recovery along the creek-adjacent portions of the field, and by the end of April, Evelyn was walking the eastern boundary every few days and making notes and trying to keep her projections conservative, because optimism in ranching was an indulgence that the land eventually charged you for. The grass was not back, but it was coming back, and the rate was consistent with what she had estimated and told Howard Greel in February, which mattered because the review provision in the lease agreement meant the numbers would be examined at 3.5 years, and she intended the numbers to say exactly what she had told Greel they would say. Colton watched her make the rounds of the east section without always joining her, which she had come to understand was not disinterest. He watched the way a man watched something he cared about deeply, and had learned, slowly and with difficulty, to stop trying to control. Gerald Winthrop did not disappear. She had not expected him to disappear. Men like Winthrop did not disappear when they lost a round. They reconsidered their approach and came back from a different direction. And Buford's log of observations, kept faithfully since February, a plain notebook that sat on the sideboard near the lamp, documented that Winthrop's men continued to appear along the north fence line at irregular intervals through March and April, always staying on their side of the line, always doing nothing that constituted a violation of anything. Watching, counting, waiting. On a Thursday in early May, a county inspection request arrived at the ranch, filed by an unnamed party with the county land office, requesting an assessment of the Voss Ranch's east section grazing practices relative to territory land management guidelines. Evelyn read the notice twice and set it on the table. "It's him," Colton said from across the room. "It's him," she agreed. "He can't touch the grazing rights for 5 years and he knows it, so he's moving to a different instrument. An inspection finding, even a minor one, goes into the county record. That record is what Greel looks at in 3.5 years. Can he manufacture a finding? He can try to create conditions for one." She thought about this carefully. Who conducts the inspection? County sends an assessor, usually someone out of the territorial office in Helena. Do you know any of them? I know one, Warren Tibbs. He's been doing land assessments in this part of the territory for 8 years. Honest man? Colton paused. I don't know who else they might send. Write to Tibbs, Evelyn said. Not about the inspection, about the water diversion work. Tell him what you've done and why, and what the results are showing. Frame it as informational. A rancher updating the county record on land improvement work. Do it before the inspection happens. Colton looked at her. So that when whoever comes to do the inspection arrives, the water work is already in the county record as a documented improvement rather than something we're explaining defensively. Yes. He was already moving toward his desk. She also wrote a letter that day. To Silas Dorn, their attorney in Billings, explaining the inspection notice and asking whether there was any basis to inquire about who had filed the unnamed complaint. She suspected the answer was no, that the process was designed to allow anonymous complaints precisely to encourage reporting. But she wanted to know the boundaries of what was possible, because understanding what you couldn't do was as important as knowing what you could. Dorn's reply arrived 10 days later. The filing party could not be required to identify themselves at this stage. However, Dorn noted, the inspection process created a record, and any pattern of inspection requests that appeared to follow a pattern of interference with a specific party's operations would itself constitute a documentable history. He recommended continuing the log. She shared the letter with Martha Calloway when she rode over the following week. Martha had her own file by now, the Calloway letters, the ones she had given Evelyn in February, augmented by 3 new incidents Martha had noted since then, smaller things that she had previously dismissed as coincidence. She was no longer dismissing them as coincidence. He's doing the same thing to me he did to James, Martha said. Slower, but the same. Yes, Evelyn said, and to the Hendersons on the north side. I've been meaning to ride up there. Martha looked at her. You're building something. Evelyn considered this. I'm documenting something. Whether it becomes something depends on what it adds up to. What does it need to add up to? A pattern that is specific enough and consistent enough that a territorial judge would find it compelling. She met Martha's eyes. Winthrop hasn't broken any single law cleanly enough to prosecute on its own. But 11 years of documented interference across multiple neighboring properties, conducted with a consistent method, that's not individual incidents, that's a practice. Martha was quiet for a long moment. James tried to explain this to me once. He said Winthrop was doing to us what we do to a tree we wanted to cut but couldn't reach, scoring the bark every year until eventually the tree died on its own. The accuracy of the image sat between them for a moment. I need to talk to the Hendersons, Evelyn said, and the Pryor family west of them, and anyone else who's had unexplained difficulties that seem to originate from the same direction. She spent 3 weeks riding to neighboring ranches. She went to 7 of them, and she did not go with demands or presentations. She went with her notebook, and she listened, and what she heard was the same story told in 7 variations. Manufactured delays, access disputes that resolved themselves after costing money and time, inspection requests that found nothing, rumors that appeared at critical moments and couldn't be traced to their source. None of the ranchers had connected their experiences to the others because they had each been experiencing them in isolation. And isolation was Winthrop's methodology. Keep each target separate, keep each incident small, ensure that no single action was large enough to justify the effort of confronting it. She connected them. By the end of May, she had a document that was considerably larger than the one she had brought to Howard Greel's office in February. She had names and dates and specific incidents from 8 ranching operations spanning 11 years, all pointing in the same direction. She had Buford's log from the Voss Ranch and James Calloway's letters and 4 other ranchers who, once they understood what they were looking at, were willing to put their names and their records behind it. The county inspection arrived on a Wednesday in June. The assessor was not Warren Tibbs. It was a younger man named Aldrich who had the appearance of someone who had been sent to do a job and was trying to determine exactly what job he had been sent to do. He arrived with a notebook and spent the morning in the east section looking at the grass and the water and the diversion channel, making notes. Evelyn walked with him the entire time. She had learned from watching Colton manage difficult men over the months she had been here that the most effective posture was not defensive and not aggressive. It was informative. Answer every question completely. Volunteer nothing that wasn't asked. Give the man the accurate picture and let him form his own conclusions. Because a man who formed his own accurate conclusion was more useful than a man who had been pushed to one. She showed Aldrich the operational log. She showed him the water level documentation going back 22 years. She showed him the diversion channel and explained the engineering of it in terms that were specific enough to be credible to anyone who actually knew land management. She showed him the grass recovery data she had been recording monthly since April. Aldrich made notes throughout. He asked reasonable questions and she gave reasonable answers. By the end of the morning, he had the demeanor of someone who had arrived expecting to find a problem and had instead found a ranch that was managing its land with more documentation and more deliberate care than most operations he probably visited. The complaint mentioned overgrazing in the east section, he said at the end, in the tone of a man meeting a requirement to cover the item. The east section's stocking rate has been reduced by 30% since February as part of the recovery plan, Evelyn said. It's in the operational log, monthly. He wrote that down. He shook hands and left before noon. Colton watched him ride out from the porch and then looked at Evelyn. Well? He'll file a clean report, she said. The complaint had nothing to work with. She was right. The report arrived from the county office 3 weeks later, found no issues of concern, and was filed in the county record. She wrote to Silas Dorn the same day with a copy of it, asking him to keep it with the other materials they had assembled. And she wrote a note in the operational log that included the date and the outcome. Every entry in that log was a small thing. That was what she had come to understand about the work she was doing, the real work, the kind that outlasted a single winter or a single negotiation or a single difficult man. It was made of small things that no one would see the importance of until you showed them all together and the shape of them became visible. Summer arrived and the east section came back fully enough to justify restoring the stocking rate in August, 2 months ahead of her most optimistic projection. Buford told her this on a morning in late July when he came in from the east boundary with numbers. And she sat with the numbers for a moment before she let herself believe them, because she had learned that the difference between a projection and a result was a specific kind of disappointment if you confused them. The numbers were real. The grass was back. She walked the east section alone that evening, after the day's work was finished and the light was going the way it went in Montana in late summer, slowly, generously, turning everything it touched a color that didn't have a clean name. The grass was knee-high in the strongest sections and solid in the rest, and the water moved along the creek line with the consistency of something that had found its right path and intended to stay in it. She stood in the middle of the east section and allowed herself for a few minutes to feel what the moment actually was. She had arrived at this ranch 8 months ago with a worn coat and a single trunk and a town full of people who had already decided what she was. She had found a piece of land that was slowly dying of a problem no one had identified, and she had identified it, and she had fixed it, and she was standing in the recovery of it. Thomas would have understood this, she thought. He had been a man who found satisfaction in fixed things, in problems identified and corrected, in the slow, visible vindication of a good decision. She had learned that from him. She had not always known that she had learned it. She went back to the ranch house and wrote the August projections in the operational log and did not say anything to Colton about the walk, because some things were interior, and the interiority of them was part of what made them real. It was Colton who said something. He came to find her after supper, which was unusual. He generally waited for things to arise naturally, rather than seeking her out. A characteristic she had come to understand was not coldness, but the habit of a man who had spent a long time being careful about what he initiated. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said. He was standing in the doorway of the office where she was working, and he had the particular quality of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and was now discovering that the preparation wasn't quite holding. She set down her pen. She waited. "This arrangement we have," he said. "The legal arrangement." "Yes." He looked at the window rather than at her. "I'd like it to be less of an arrangement." She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a man who said things that cost him nothing. The things he said that cost him something were worth the cost. "What would that look like?" she said. He turned from the window. It would look like a marriage, he said. An actual one. Not a business arrangement with a legal framework. He held her gaze. I understand if that's not if the current arrangement is what you prefer. I'm not asking for anything. I'm saying that I would prefer something different, if you were willing. She thought about how to answer honestly. I don't know if I'm good at that, she said. The kind of marriage you're describing. Thomas and I, it was a real marriage, but it was practical. We respected each other. I don't know if I know how to do something that isn't built from practical things. I'm not asking for something that isn't built from practical things, Colton said. I know you better than that. A pause. I'm asking for practical things with something underneath them. She thought about this. She thought about the 8 months that had just passed. The arguments and the late-night accounting and the storm and the billings meeting and the East section and all the accumulated mornings and evenings of working alongside someone who gave her full weight as a thinking person, who had learned to trust her read of situations, who sat across from her at the kitchen table and made room in his decisions for her judgment. She thought about the pie in the restaurant in Billings and the easy way she had reached for his fork without thinking about it, and how neither of them had commented on it. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right. That's my answer, she said. All right. Something changed in his face that she did not try to name, because the name for it would have been too large for the moment, and the moment did not need anything large. He nodded once. He left the doorway. She picked up her pen and went back to the projections, and 10 minutes later she heard him in the kitchen beginning the same process he always began at this hour, banking the fire against the night, and the sound of it was entirely ordinary and somehow entirely new, which was the particular quality of things that had shifted without announcing themselves. They were married again, formally, before a justice of the peace in Granger's Bluff, on a Saturday in September, with Pratt and his wife as witnesses, and Martha Calloway in attendance because she had driven 2 hours in a wagon to be there, and nobody had specifically told her to come, but nobody had specifically told her not to. The ceremony was brief. The justice was efficient. Evelyn wore the better of her 2 good dresses, which was not a remarkable dress by any measure, and Colton wore his best coat, which had been cleaned and pressed by Decker that morning with a thoroughness that suggested Decker had opinions about the importance of the occasion that he was expressing through laundry. Gerald Winthrop was in town that day. He was at the Mercantile when they walked out of the justice's office, and he saw them, and they saw him see them. He stood for a moment and then turned and went inside the store, and Evelyn watched the door close behind him and understood that what she was seeing was a man recalibrating again, deciding what the new landscape meant for whatever he was planning. She would deal with that when the time came. It would come. What came first was October, and with October the final stage of the work she had been building toward since the conversation with Silas Dorn, the documented pattern of interference across 8 ranching operations, was ready to be taken to the territorial circuit judge who held jurisdiction over land use complaints in this district. She had talked to Dorn about this in stages throughout the summer, and Dorn had been careful about her expectations in the way that good attorneys were careful, explaining that a pattern of behavior that looked clear from inside the experience of it was harder to make look clear to a judge who was seeing it for the first time, and that the legal standard for what constituted actionable interference was specific and demanding. She had heard all of this and held it accurately, not dismissing it and not being defeated by it. The file she brought to Dorn's office in Billings in the first week of October was the largest document she had assembled. 8 ranchers, 11 years. Dates, amounts, specific incidents, official records that cross-reference to the incidents. James Calloway's letters. Buford's log. The pattern was not argued in the document. She had specifically resisted the urge to argue it. The pattern was simply shown, laid out in chronological order across 8 separate operations, and she let the parallel structure do what parallel structures do when they're specific enough. They speak for themselves. Dorn read the file in 2 sittings over 1 day. When he was finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. This is the most organized private land complaint documentation I have seen in 20 years of practice, he said. Does it meet the standard? He brought his gaze back down. It meets the standard for filing. Whether it meets the standard for finding is a judge's determination. He paused. But I will tell you that the pattern here it's not ambiguous. A judge who reads this document and does not see a coordinated practice of interference is not reading it carefully. She filed the complaint in October. The process, Dorn had explained, was not fast. The territorial court system operated on a schedule that respected neither urgency nor impatience, and the judge who would hear this matter had a calendar that was months deep at any given time. She had accepted this. What she had not anticipated, and perhaps should have, because Winthrop had always been faster than she expected, was that word of the filing reached Winthrop before the month was out, and that Winthrop's response was immediate and more direct than anything he had done before. He came to the ranch himself. He came alone, which was the same calculation he had made in the winter after the storm. The decision that arriving without men was a statement about confidence rather than vulnerability. He rode into the yard on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, and Evelyn was the first person to see him because she was coming back from the east section and was still mounted when he appeared on the road. She did not go inside for Colton. She pulled up her horse and waited. Winthrop stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at her with an expression that had none of the performative contempt of their earlier encounters, and none of the calculating assessment that had followed. What his expression held now was something more direct, a man who had decided on an approach. "You've made a filing," he said. "There's a legal process underway," she said. "Yes." "You understand that this kind of complaint, this kind of document, causes damage to reputations, to business relationships, to things that matter." "The document contains facts," Evelyn said. "Dated, specific, verifiable facts. Damage that comes from facts is a different kind of damage than damage that comes from manufactured disputes and anonymous complaints." He looked at her steadily. "What do you want?" She had been waiting for this question. She had thought about it for several months in the specific way she thought about things that mattered. Not with anger, not with the desire for drama, but with the practical clarity that was her natural register. "I want you to stop," she said. "Stop the interference with the Voss operation and the Callaway operation and the Henderson operation and the others, specifically and permanently. I want it on record that it has stopped, and I want enough time to pass that the stopping is real and not a pause. And if I do that, the filing goes away?" "The filing is a legal matter in a territorial court. I can't make it go away. What I can do is ensure that the ranchers who contributed to it know that the underlying conduct has ceased, which affects how they respond to any court inquiries about whether relief is still sought." She held his gaze. "But that depends on the conduct actually ceasing." "You're asking me to accept?" "I'm not asking you for anything," she said, and her voice was level and without heat, which was more effective than anger, and she knew it. "I'm explaining what the next several months look like depending on decisions that are yours to make. You have a choice. You could fight the filing and spend a significant amount of money on legal representation and potentially face findings that go into the permanent territorial record. Or you could make a business decision that costs you nothing except the practice you've been running." She let that sit. "I've found that careful men usually prefer the option that doesn't cost them money." Winthrop was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Colton, who had evidently seen the rider from a window, came out onto the porch and stood there. Evelyn did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Winthrop. "You know," Winthrop said slowly, "when you arrived here, when I saw you step off that stage, I know what you thought," she said. "I was wrong," he said. It came out like something that had been sitting in him and had found the only exit available to it. "Yes," she said. "You were." He turned his horse. He rode back the way he had come, and he did not look back, and she watched him go until the road was empty and the sound of his horse was absorbed into the general silence of October. Colton came down from the porch. "What did he say?" he asked. "He's going to think about it," she said, "and he's going to make the right decision, because he's a man who runs careful calculations, and the calculation is obvious." "You're certain?" She thought about the look on Winthrop's face when he said he had been wrong. There was something in the quality of that admission, a heaviness that was more than strategy, more than a man calculating his legal exposure. It was the expression of someone who had looked at the last 11 years and understood, for perhaps the first time, That what he had built in that time was not an empire, but a habit, and the habit had finally produced a consequence he hadn't planned for. Not certain, she said honestly, but probable. She was right. Winthrop did not respond to the territorial court filing, did not hire attorneys, did not contest it in any form. The judge, in December, noted the absence of any meaningful response to the documented pattern and issued findings that were entered into the territorial record. Not criminal findings, not rulings that imposed penalties, but findings of documented conduct that would exist in that record for as long as the record existed. They were the kind of findings that made future conduct of the same type considerably more difficult to deny. The interference stopped, not with any announcement or formal cessation. It simply stopped, the way a practice stops when the conditions that made it viable are removed. Buford's log, maintained through the end of the year, recorded no appearances of Winthrop's men on the north fence line after November. The log continued. Evelyn had told Buford to keep it indefinitely. Old habits of documentation were not bad habits to have. The 3.5-year review with Howard Greele took place in August of 1887, and Evelyn and Colton rode to Billings together on a morning that was warm and bright with the specific quality that Montana summers had when they were in full expression. She had the numbers in her bag, organized the same way she organized everything, chronologically, specifically, without interpretation, letting the figures carry the argument themselves. The East Section's productivity had exceeded the projection she had given Greele in February of 1884. Not dramatically, not by the kind of margin that looks like you were sandbagging your estimates, but by 8% over 3.5 years, which was enough to be meaningful and modest enough to be credible. Greele looked at the numbers and then looked at Evelyn with the expression she had first seen on his face when she set the Callaway letters on his desk. The expression of a careful man encountering something that had delivered what it promised. "The lease stands," he said. "Will extend to the full 5-year term with an option for another 5 at this rate if the productivity holds." Another 5 years. She did the arithmetic automatically, the way she always did. By the end of the second term, she would be 53 years old, and the East Section would have been fully recovered for over 8 years, and the Voss operation would be on ground that even the most pessimistic accounting would have to call solid. She thought about this woman who had stepped off a stage in Granger's Bluff in 1883 with a worn coat and a single trunk. She thought about Gerald Winthrop's laughter. She thought about the 2 dead cattle in the snow, and the letter she had sent to Greele the first time, and the way Colton had said her name, Evelyn, with the particular care of someone choosing a word rather than simply using it. She did not try to turn any of it into a lesson. She distrusted lessons, the tidy extraction of meaning from experience, the way people reduced complicated years into single sentences that fit on paper. Life did not reduce that way, and she had never trusted the reduction. What she believed was simpler than a lesson and harder to say. She believed that the most important quality a person could bring to a difficult situation was not courage, which was called for rarely and dramatically and in moments that announced themselves, but something quieter and more demanding. The capacity to see clearly, to think ahead, to do the next necessary thing when the necessary thing was neither heroic nor visible nor guaranteed to work. To build a log that no one would read for 3 years. To write a letter before you knew if you needed one. To walk a fence line in the dark and count what you had and be honest about the number. She believed that most of the important things in a life were decided not in the large dramatic moments, but in the accumulated small ones, and that the only way to be ready for the large moments when they came was to have spent the small moments building something that would hold. She had arrived at the Voss Ranch with nothing that looked like advantage. No wealth, no family name, no youth, no elegance. What she had brought was something that looked, from the outside, like merely being practical, and she had spent 3.5 years demonstrating that being practical, applied with intelligence and persistence, was the rarest and most durable form of strength she had ever encountered. The ride back from Billings was quieter than the ride there. Not because anything was wrong, but because they had both said the necessary things in Greele's office, and the rest was the kind of quiet that comes after something has been completed and before the next thing has announced itself. Montana in August had a specific way of making silence feel earned rather than empty. The sky was very large, and the land was very particular, and the road ran between them in a way that accommodated thought without demanding it. Halfway back, Colton said, "What are you thinking?" She considered the question and decided to answer it honestly, the way she always decided to answer things. "I'm thinking about the East section," she said, "whether we should look at the stalking rate again in September. Buford had numbers last week that I want to go over." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's what you're thinking?" "Yes." "Not about the meeting, not about the 5 years." The meeting went the way it was going to go. The 5 years is information. The East section is something I can actually do something about. He rode for a moment without speaking. Then he made the sound that was his version of a laugh, not a full one, something smaller and more private. "Clara would have thought about the 5 years," he said. "Different people think about different things," Evelyn said. "Yes," he said, "they do." They reached the ranch before dark, the way they had planned, and the yard was quiet in the way of evenings when the work had been done, and the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and the house was waiting the way houses wait, without impatience, without judgment, simply available for whatever the people inside it needed it to be. Decker had left supper. Cal, who was 21 now and no longer afraid to admit anything, had apparently fixed a section of kitchen wall that had been showing a crack since spring, with results that were structurally sound if aesthetically imperfect, which was entirely consistent with Cal's general approach to things. Marsh was retired now, living with his daughter in a town 50 miles east, but he had come back last month for the cattle sorting and had spent 3 days telling the younger hands what to do and being largely ignored and being entirely right. And Evelyn thought about him sometimes with the specific kind of affection that attached to people who were honest about what they knew and honest about what they couldn't do anymore. She sat at the kitchen table after supper, the operational log open in front of her, and wrote the entry for the day. August 1887, Greel meeting, lease extended, second 5-year term, option included. East section review, September. Colton was across the table from her. He had the account ledger open, making the corresponding entries in his own handwriting, the careful, precise handwriting she knew as well as her own now. Outside, the East section was resting under the August stars, fully itself again. The water running in the channel that Buford and Decker and Cal had cut in the cold of March 4 years ago, the grass thick and dark and permanent looking in the way that only things with sound roots looked in the dark. Evelyn closed the log. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere you hadn't expected to arrive, and to find that the arriving was not an ending but a beginning of something longer and less legible than anything you could have planned for. She thought about the 40 depleted acres in Colorado and the way she had walked away from them, and the way walking away had been necessary and right, and also a loss that she carried in a specific place that wasn't grief and wasn't regret, but was something that didn't have a clean name. She thought about the woman who had laughed on the stage from Colorado and looked at her own reflection in the window of the coach, and understood, for the first time in years, that she didn't know what was coming next. She still didn't know what was coming next. That had not changed. What had changed was the ground she was standing on when the not knowing arrived, and the person sitting across the table from her who had learned to trust her read of things, and the land outside the window that was a different land than the one she had arrived to because she had made it different, and the name in the operational log that was both names now, Hartwell and Voss together in the same ink, which was not a small thing even if she did not make a large thing of it. She put the log away. She went to the window and looked out at the dark over the East section, and she thought, this is what it feels like to have built something that will last. Not perfect, not finished, not safe from whatever was coming next, because nothing was safe from that, and anyone who told you otherwise was selling you something. But built, solid-rooted, like the grass, capable of withstanding what came at it. That was enough. That had always been enough. It was just that most people, in her experience, spent their whole lives waiting for something more than enough, and in the waiting missed the thing they already had. She went to bed. In the morning there was work to do, and she intended to do it.